Okay, so this is the last shir of the year, of this cycle. So we'll be finishing up Masechet Avodah Zarah, or at least the midrashim that we'll be looking at in Masechet Avodah Zarah. Right, we spent the first half of the year doing Yevamo, the second half of the year doing Avodah Zarah. They're roughly the same length in the Yaakov. So the Yaakov goes on a bit more after the mission we're going to be doing, but I think this was actually an interesting topic that I figured it was a fitting way to finish off the year. It's a Gemara from Avodah Zarah and Chaf Hey Amud Aleph, and it's dealing with kind of the famous or the infamous episode of the story that's told in Sefer Yoshua, Perek Yud, where the sun and the moon stood still in the sky. Right, just to kind of refresh our memory briefly, in the middle of a battle between Bnei Israel and some Amorite kings, so Yoshua says, Shemesh b'givon dom, v'yarach be'emek ayalon, right, that the sun and the moon should stand still. And then the Psukim tell us that they stand still, that Bnei Israel win the battle, and then we're also told that this is the record of that victory is written in this book called Sefer HaYashar, which we're not going to actually look at inside, but our Gemara actually asks, what is Sefer HaYashar? And what is this work that records kind of the victory? And there's various opinions in the Gemara, and then modern scholars, posit that Sefer HaYashar is some lost work that records kind of, battles. But the various opinions of the Gemara have different opinions of what Sefer HaYashar is actually a reference to. Be that as it may, we're going to be looking at the Gemara, basically three layers of that story. Right? There's the story itself. The Gemara is going to try to understand the how. Like, how did the miracle unfold? What are the technical details of it, as it were? The midrashim that we're going to look at are going to try to understand why. Like, why did this miracle happen? And then we're going to look at some Rishonim who grapple with they grapple with the how. The Gemara grapples with the how in the sense of how did the miracle unfold, but the Rishonim grapple with the how in the larger kind of philosophical sense of like, how did the sun and the moon actually stop moving? So we'll see each of those layers, and the Rishonim in particular kind of are struggling with it from like a rational philosophical perspective. So we'll see the Ralbag actually has a pretty extreme interpretation because he finds it so difficult. So let's get started. So the Gemara in Avodah Zarah Chaf Hey Amud Bet Aleph says as follows. Right, the pasuk in Yoshua says, "Vayidom Hashemesh v'yareach amad ad yukum goy oivav halo yiktuva al Sefer HaYashar." So the sun stood still and the moon stood still until Bnei Israel managed to avenge their enemy and wipe out the Amorites to win the battle. As it's written in Sefer, is it not written in Sefer HaYashar, recorded in this book? My Sefer HaYashar, Amar B'chir Ba'am Amar Yochanan, Ze Sefer Avraham Yitzchak V'Yaakov, Shnikru Yesharim, Shne'emar Tamod Nafshi Mot Yesharim. Okay, so again, we're not going to dwell on this too much. Rabbi Yochanan says that Sefer HaYashar is a reference to Bereshit, because Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were Yesharim, they were the upright ones. And so it's the Sefer HaYashar, the book of the Avot, basically. As it says in the prophecy of Bilam aspires to die the death of the Yesharim, and it's a reference to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And then where's the hint to it? That when Yaakov, at the end of Sefer Bereshit, is blessing his sons, his blessing for Ephraim is Zaro Yem Elo Goyim. Alright, that Ephraim's offspring should fill the nations. So it asks, Ematay Yem Elo Goyim, when will that happen? B'sha'ah Shamda Lo Chama Yoshua. So Yeshua was a descendant of Ephraim, so that's when his offspring fills the nations. Okay, very nice. And then the Gemara says, Vayamod Hashemesh b'chatzi hashemayim v'lo atz lavo k'yom tamim. The wording here is very important. Okay, so when the miracle is described, it says the sun stood, Vayamod Hashemesh b'chatzi hashemayim, the halfway point of the sky, v'lo atz lavo k'yom tamim. And it did not, atz is like hasten, a hurry, it did not hasten to set like a normal, regular day. Okay, so that's the simple understanding of these words, that the sun stood in the middle of the sky, did not hasten to set like a regular day, or like a full day. Okay, and so the Gemara asks, V'chama, so how long did this happen? How long was the sun actually in the sky and not moving for? And now quotes a whole bunch of opinions. Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Esrim va'arba shai. Right? It was 24 hours. Azil shit v'kam shit, azil shit v'kam shit. So it moved for 6 and it stopped for 6. It moved for 6 and it stopped for 6. So there were these 2 cycles of move, stop, where the whole thing lasted 24 hours. It was actually not moving for a total of 12 hours. Kula milta kiyom tamim. And when it says kiyom tamim, which means like a full day, that referred to the entire cycle of going and stopping, going and stopping. Rabbi Elazar amar shloshim v'shit. Right? That it's not 24 hours, but it was 36 hours. Azil shit v'kam tresar, azil shit v'kam tresar. It went 6 and stopped 12. Went 6 and stopped 12. Amidato kiyom tamim. And so it wasn't the full cycle that took 24 hours. It was the amount of time the sun stood still that was 24 hours. And so then it was 6 and 12 standing still, 6 and 12 standing still, so 24 hours total. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani amar 48. The whole thing took 48 hours. Azil shit v'kam tresar, azil shit v'kam 24. Shneimar v'lo atz lavo kiyom tamim, miklal d'mikar lav kiyom tamim hava. Okay, and then he gives another opinion that says that the whole thing was 48 hours instead of 36 or 24. Then another version is recorded. Ika de'alme b'tosefta. Plige Rabbi Shua ben Plige. Rabbi Shua ben Levi amar 24 azil shit v'kam tresar, azil shit v'kam tresar, midato kiyom tamim, etc., etc. Basically, there's 2 versions of this machloket. One version says that they're arguing about the time of the total period, and one version says they're arguing about how much time was added on for the sun standing still. And so the version which says the total period, it was 24 was total period, 36 was total period, 48 was total period. The version of Tosefta says that it was 24 added on, 36 added on, 40 added on. But what the rabbis are all arguing about, and this is something that is going to be discussed a bit later in the Maharsha, the rabbis they're not fundamentally arguing with each other here, right? They're arguing about like the details of how many hours, but they agree on like the fundamentals of what happened in the miracle. Whereas they're all seeming to agree on A, that there was 2 cycles. There was a period of going and stopping and going and stopping. And B, that this Yom Tamim is somehow a reference to like the length of time that the miracle occurred for, as opposed to just saying that the sun did not set like the way it normally does. So they don't disagree on the interpretation of the pasuk, except for the amount of time the miracle happened. The Maharshak takes issue with that.
It's interesting that they're like they're darshaning from the Porka Yom Tamim.
Yeah.
Because I would have, like, the beginning of that pasuk says V'yamot Hashem b'chetzi hashemayim. That sounds like it's a specific point. B'chetzi hashemayim.
Okay, good. Yeah.
It sounds like there's not where they're getting a cycle from that. It sounds like it's the sun was like static.
Right, exactly. That's
what it says. In fact, that's actually what it says. Like, literally what it says. Yeah.
You're right. That's exact. We're actually about to read. It's a good point. The Ben Yoyada asks that very question. To your point, he says, why are they all assuming a 2-cycle situation, right? Right. To your point, like if you just read it, it would just be the sun stopped and it didn't set. Right? That's the pshat.
Yeah.
Right. Good point. Yep. Good question. Okay, so the Maharsha says, actually before the Maharsha, because he quotes Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, let's just read Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, Perik Nun Bet. So he says, Miyom shenivru shemayim va'aretz, Hashemesh v'ayerech v'kochavim v'chol ha'mazalot yu olin la'ir ha'aretz ve'enan me'arin ze im ze. So from the day that everything was created, right, the heavens and the earth and the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations, from the day they were created, they rise to light up the world, and they don't interfere with each other. Right? They have their place in the system of the cosmos. Each one has his space. They don't get in each other's way. Until Yeshua came along and fought the wars of Israel. And here Pirkei Rabbi says something very interesting. V'gi'a erev Shabbat. It's Friday afternoon. V'ra'a b'tzaratan shel Yisrael shelo yichalu et Shabbat. Right? And here, Tzaratan Shel Yisrael is a euphemism for Yisrael themselves. Right? He didn't want Bnei Yisrael to violate Shabbat. And they're fighting a war, which obviously involves Chilul Shabbat. And it's Friday afternoon. So he's afraid if the war continues, they'll go into Shabbat and they'll violate Shabbat. And furthermore, Yeshua saw that, and furthermore, Yeshua knew that the astrologers of the nations saw in the constellations that as the day and night would unfold, those constellations would tell the defeat of Israel. Ma'asa Yeshua, what did he do? Pashat yad le'or hashemesh u'or yareach v'izkir lehem et Hashem. So he stretched his hands out to the sun and the moon, and he said the holy name. Ve'amad kol echad mimkomo. Shisha u'shloshim sha'ot al motzei Shabbat. So everything just stood ground to a halt and stood that way for 36 hours. So it's Friday afternoon, 36 hours pass. It's already Motzei Shabbat, and the sun is still in the sky. Shneimar vayidom hashemesh ve'yareach amad ad yakum goy oivav. So basically, the battle finished before Shabbat set in, because Shabbat set in once the sun goes down. So by doing this, Yeshua prevented a chilul Shabbos, and he prevented the signs that the astrologers saw that would lead to the defeat of Israel from coming to fruition. So we'll just finish this quickly and then we'll talk about it. So Vayamod Hashem b'chatzi hashamayim v'lo'atz lavo k'yom tamim. Right, that's what the pasuk says. Kol malchei haaretz v'tamo. All the kings of the nation saw this and were shocked. Right, shelo ya kamo miyom shenivra olam. Something like this had never happened since creation. Shneimar, because the pasuk itself tells us, and this will be very important later when we read the Ralbag, the Tanakh says, "V'lo haya kayom ahu lefanav ve'acharav lo yiyeh ken lishmoa Hashem b'kol ish ki Hashem nilcham b'Yisrael." Right, the Sefer Yeshua says there had never been a day like that before, and there will never be a day like that again. Meaning what? That God listened to the voice of a single man, because God fought on behalf of Israel. It was a unique event in history. So, what's motivating this Medrash in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer? So I would argue that, among other things, it's trying to understand why Yeshua felt compelled to stop the sun and the moon, right? In other words, just from the story, you have they're fighting this battle, but this isn't the only battle Yeshua is fighting. Right? They fought lots of battles. So why now is Yeshua saying to the sun and the moon, stop? So he's motivated by Shabbat, and he's motivated by these astrologers. And that kind of gives the why behind why, essentially what was the reason behind this miracle having to be performed. It also justifies why God listened, or why God agreed to do something so crazy and so miraculous, because it was for the sake of Shabbat, and for the sake of Kavod Shabbat, so even the sun and the moon can come to a halt. So it also teaches you how important it is to avoid violating Shabbos. So that's the Medrash in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. So now the Maharsha says, okay, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer Amrinan da 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 da. Okay, v'zeh k'divrei Rabbi Rashban l'shon harishon, or k'divrei Rabbi Eliezer l'shon hasheni, d'bishmatin, she'ai midah lamed vav shaot. So the Maharsha just notes that, right, the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says that the miracle happened for 36 hours. So the Maharsha says, by the way, so that's in accordance with the opinion amongst the rabbis who are arguing about how many hours. It's in accordance with the rabbi who says 36 hours. So according to the first version, that was 36 total hours, is Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. According to the second version, where it was 36 additional hours where the sun was paused, so that's Rabbi Elazar. Regardless, that's what the Maharsha says. And then he says, Ve'en la'akshot ma chilu Shabbat hayasham, kevan daya milchemet chova, k'mo shutar le'em milchemet b'Shabbat b'Yericho. The Maharsha says, I can ask a question though. I could say, if Yeshua is afraid of Bnei Israel violating Shabbos, but why is he afraid? This is a Milchemet Mitzvah, right? Because they're conquering Eretz Yisrael. It's a Milchemet Mitzvah, and we know that Milchemet Mitzvah you can violate Shabbat. How do we know that Milchemet Mitzvah you can violate Shabbat? Because we know that they were allowed to fight when they were conquering Yericho. How do we know that? Sorry, I'm skipping. How do we know that Yericho was a Milchemet Mitzvah and it violated Shabbat? That they fought on Shabbat? Because Yericho was 7 days, right? It says explicitly you have to surround the city for 7 days and blow on the shofarot, etc. So you have to include Shabbat in that period. So the Maharsha says, don't ask that question. That's not a good question. You can say that this battle against the Amorite kings which we're discussing, was not a Muhammad mitzvah. Shelo ba'u b'milchama zo lichbosh Eretz Yisrael, ela le'atzil yoshvei Giv'on k'mifurash b'kra. That one answer you can give is that the context of this battle was not unlike all the battles previously. Like Sefer Yeshua Prakim Aleph through Chet is like war, the leading up to and the wars of conquering Eretz Yisrael, and those are Milchemet Mitzvah. But then in Parak Tet, these people come, the Yoshvei Giv'on come and make a covenant with Yoshua. And then Parak Yud, the Amorite kings go and attack them. So Yoshua he has an alliance with these people, so they come and say to Yoshua, come save us from these Amorite kings. So Yoshua goes and attacks the Amorite kings. But it's not to conquer Eretz Yisrael, it's because he's allied with the people being attacked. So the Maharsha says, it's not, so see from here, it's not a Milchemet Mitzvah. And since it's not a Milchemet Mitzvah, but rather just a war to help defend their allies, that's why Yoshua wasn't sure that they could violate Shabbat. That's why he was concerned. That's why he requested the sun and the moon or demanded that the sun and the moon stop. That's one answer the Maharsha gives. Another answer is Yericho Nami Horat Shahaya. You can say that the battle of Yericho was a one-time mitzvah. Because the Gemara in the Yerushalmi says, if a person says to you, how could Yoshua have violated Shabbat while conquering Yericho? So Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ani Amarti Lo. Right? God will say, I told Yoshua to violate Shabbat when conquering Yericho. As the pasuk says, "V'sabotem et ha'ir shiv'a pa'amim," circle the city 7 times. Kot ta'asun shiva yamim, do it 7 days. V'mein shiva yamim below Shabbat, and there's no such thing as 7 consecutive days without Shabbat. So basically, you can say Yericho isn't a question because this is not a Milchemet Mitzvah because it was not conquering Eretz Yisrael, or even if you don't want to say that, but you can say Yericho isn't a challenge because Yericho was a one-time dispensation. God says violate Shabbat even to conquer Yericho, so I can't learn from that I should do that in other wars. And he says that there's a drasha where when it talks about when you're going to war against a city until you conquer it, and there's a drasha that says you can do that even on Shabbat, so it's only when the war started at least 3 days before Shabbat started. But if the war started on Friday, then you're not allowed to do that. Okay, there's a drasha in Halacha in Masechet Shabbat. So that's the Maharsha. The Ben Yehoyada now asks your question, Michael. He says, "Baram Maharsha zal hiksha lechulu amorai." And this is actually, I had the 3 dots in the Maharsha. The Maharsha, we actually skipped the first part of the Maharsha where he asks your question, and the Ben Yehoyada quotes it. Right? Hiksha lechulu amorai. The Maharsha initially asks a question, all the Amoraim in the Gemara. Right? Tzarich latei tam, lama lo amida b'pa'am achat b'shiur ha'amada shel shnei pa'amim. Why 2 cycles? Why not 1 cycle? Why not say that if you're concerned about Yom Tamim and how long Yom Tamim is, so say it was 24 consecutive hours, 36 consecutive hours. Why are you breaking it up into 2 sections? Why are you obsessed with that idea? V'nir eli, and it seems to me, says the Ben Yehoyada, that nechla kanes l'shnei chalukot, that perhaps the miracle is divided into 2 sections, 2 cycles. Kedei l'kayim shtei brachot. Achat shel Yaakov Avinu alav hashalom, shebarcho v'zar'o yeh melo agoyim, k'mo she'amar Rabbi Yochanan, because there were 2 blessings that this battle was the fulfillment of. One was a blessing of Yaakov Avinu, when he blessed Ephraim on his deathbed, and he said, Zaro yeh melo agoyim, which as Rabbi Yochanan said in the Gemara, that was fulfilled in the time of Yoshua when he made the sun and the moon stop. והשנייה של משה רבינו עליו השלום, שברך אותו באמרו, בהם אמין יגח ככתב אפסי הארץ, כמו שאמר רבי אלעזר. So that's a part of the Gemara we didn't quote, but Rabbi Elazar actually says Sefer Yashar is not Breshit, like Rabbi Yochanan says, but it's Sefer Dvarim. And he brings a proof from when Moshe blesses Shevet Ephraim, and says, Bahem amim yinegach kechtav afsei haaretz, and that is fulfilled in the time of Yoshua when he stops the sun. So basically the Ben Yehoyada says, I can take Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of Sefer Yashar, which is Sefer Breshit, a reference to Yaakov's blessing of Ephraim, and Rabbi Elazar's interpretation that it's referring to Sefer Dvarim, which is Moshe's blessing of Ephraim, and say, I want to honor both opinions. No, it's both Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, but really it means honor both the bracha of Yaakov and the bracha of Moshe, like if I paskin like both and say both brachot were realized through this episode with Yoshua and the son, so l'shtehen asa nes, l'shtei chalukot, achat b'shvil Yaakov Avinu, v'achat b'shvil Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why the Ben Yehoyada offers all the rabbis say that the miracle happened in two sections. It was two cycles of movement and stoppage. One was to pay homage and to fulfill the bracha of Yaakov. One was to pay homage to fulfill the bracha of Moshe. That's the Ben Yehoyada's suggestion. I think the question's better than the answer.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not a great answer.
So I think we'll see a bit later in the Rishonim who try to understand this more on a pshat level, but I think that maybe the simple way to understand it is the pasuk is a bit repetitive. Right? It says Vayamor Hashemesh b'chatzi hashamayim v'lo atz lavo k'yom tamim. You can say, okay, it stopped halfway through the sky and it didn't set. So why do I need to know that it stopped halfway through the sky and it didn't set? Those are saying the same thing. So the rabbis are trying, maybe seeing that as kind of some sense that there were two things going on.
Right. Yeah.
But the Maharsha and the Ben Yehoyada are also troubled by the question, like the fact that they interpret it as two cycles. Good. All right. So I know it's already 9. This is the last year of the year, so we're gonna go over because. All right, cool. Because there's a few makoros here I want to go through. So let's learn 2 more midrashim now that try to understand the back and forth between Yoshua and the sun and the moon, and then we'll look at the Rishonim's interpretations. So the Midrash in Breishi Rabbah Perek Vav Piskatet says as follows: Amar b'Shimon Bar Yochai, Sefer Mishneh Torah signon liYoshua b'shah shenigla lo Kadosh Baruch Hu mitzao Yoshev v'Sefer Mishneh Torah bi'yado. So the Mishneh Torah was like this symbol of protection for Yoshua. How so? When Hashem appeared to Yoshua, in the beginning of Sefer Yoshua, God appears to him and says to him, Lo yamish Sefer Torah ze mipicha v'yigitu bo yamam v'layla. So when God appeared to him, the Medrash says, God saw that Yoshua was sitting with Sefer Mishneh Torah, which is Sefer Devarim in his hands. Amar lo, God said to him, Chazak Yoshua, Amat Yoshua, Chazak ve'amatz, Sefer Torah mipicha, etc., etc. The Talover alo legalgal chama, and so this is what Yoshua showed to the sun. Yoshua took this and showed it to the sun. It was his Sefer Mishneh Torah, his Sefer Dvarim. Amar la, Yoshua said to the sun, Kashem shelo domamti mizeh, afata domil fanai. Just as I did not stop from learning the Mishneh Torah, like I never stopped like reciting Torah, Vigita bo yomam v'layla, so too you should stop when I demand that you stop going across the sky. Miyad, and immediately that is what happens. Vaydom hashemesh v'yerech lamad, the sun stopped, or stood still. So somehow Yoshua uses the fact that he was learning Sefer Dvarim non-stop as a way to coerce the sun into stopping in the sky. Amar Yitzchak, Amar lo avda bisha la zavina da'abaat, lo kach ra'a otcha abba b'chalom, v'nei hashemesh v'yarech v'gomer, miyad v'ydom hashemesh v'yarech. Yitzchak adds that Yeshua also was forceful with the son and said to him, you're a bad servant. Because father, lo kach ra'a otcha abba b'chalom, father saw in a vision, or in a dream. Yoshua, when he says father, he's referring to Yosef, because he's from Shevet Ephraim, that Yosef saw in a dream to his brothers that the sun, the moon, and the stars all bowed down to Yosef. So Yoshua is saying, you're being a bad servant. I'm your master. Yosef saw the sun, the moon, and the stars bowing down to him. I'm Yosef's descendant. You have to pay homage to me. And so when he said that, the sun bowed down. The sun agreed to stop in the sky. So this is Bereshit Rabbah having a bit of a different take than Pirkei Rebbe Lezer. Pirkei Rebbe Lezer tried to understand what motivated Yoshua to ask the sun to stop. Here we're trying to understand why the sun agreed to stop, because it's such a tremendous miracle. The Midrash Tanchuma also kind of says something a bit similar, but it adds in a dialogue between Yoshua and the sun. The sun protests; it doesn't just agree silently. V'ruach hakodesh tzovachat kimi mizrach shemesh ad mevo'o gadol shmi bagoyim. So, right, we have this pasuk where it says, from sunrise to sunset, My name is great amongst the nations. Misha she'ashemesh zoreach ad sha'ah shu shokea. From the time that the sun rises to when it sets, ein kiluso shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu posek bipiv. Excuse me. The sun does not stop praising God. From the moment it rises to the moment it sets, it is constantly and continuously singing God's praises. That is the idea behind from sunrise to sunset. God's name is great because the sun is singing its praises constantly. When Yoshua got up and did war in Givon, Maktiv Sham, Az yidaber Yoshua LaHashem, B'yom tet Hashem et Emori lifnei b'nei Yisrael, V'yomer le'nei Yisrael, Shemesh b'Givon dom. Right, what does it say there? Yoshua then said to God, on the day that God gave the Amorites to B'nei Yisrael in battle, so he said, before Yisrael, Shemesh b'Givon dom, the sun should stop in Givon, and the moon should stop in Emek Ayalon, etc. So, Bikesh Yoshua l'shatek et hachama. Yoshua tried to silence the sun. Amar lo, he said to the sun, Shemesh b'Givon dom. He said, be silent. Lo amar amod el adom. Dom is be silent, not stand still. So when it says Vaydom HaShemesh, it doesn't mean the sun stood still. It means the sun was silent. So what does that mean the sun was silent? Lama amar lo dom, shekol zman shu mekales yesh bo koach le'alech. Damam amad. The idea being that the sun is constantly singing God's praises by virtue of its moving across the sky. So once the sun stops moving, then he stops singing praises. So he can fall silent. So if Yeshua tells him to fall silent, he'll stop moving. The sun said to Yeshua, the sun says to Yeshua, who are you? Man, to tell me to stop moving. How dare you? So Amar lo, hen. Yeshua says to him, yeah, I dare. Amar lo, the sun says to him, so sun says, if I stop moving, who will sing God's praises? Because God has to be praised at every second. And if I stop moving, I'm silenced. Who sings for God? So Amar lo, Yeshua says to him, Dom ata v'ni omer shira ba'avorecha. Shnemar az yedaber Yeshua LaHashem ve'en az el shira shnemar az Yishem Moshe. So Yeshua says, I'll sing God's praises while you're standing in the heavens. How do we know that Yeshua did that? Because the pasuk says, Az yedaber Yeshua. Yeshua then spoke to God, but Az, right, reminds us of Az Yishem Moshe. So the Midrash concludes there's no Az except for a song. So it's similar to the Bereshit Rabbah, it's a bit more detailed here, where basically Yeshua argues with the sun and says, in Bereshit Rabbah it says, I'm learning the Sefer Torah, so you have to listen to me, and here Yeshua is saying, I will sing songs so that you have to listen to me, and don't worry about God being praised, I'll make sure that he's praised through my song. Okay, so again, kind of trying to understand a bit more like why the sun and the moon were listening to Yeshua, what gave Yeshua the power to get them to stop, and then also pick it up with Ezra with Shabbat. Why did Yeshua want them to stop to begin with? So the Midrashim are trying to kind of understand the why. So we saw how the Gemara tries to understand the how in terms of how many hours, and the Maharsha and the Ben Yehoyada's take on that. Try to understand why they broke it up into two and the motivation behind why they did that. We saw the Midrashim, Pirkei Eliezer, Bereshit Rabbah, and the Midrash Tanchuma and Achremot, Parak Tet, about why the sun agreed to stop and why Yeshua was motivated to get it to stop. But now let's try to understand, like all of this, until we get to the Rishonim, nobody really seems to address the much larger fundamental question of this miracle, which is, how did this miracle actually happen? Right? In other words, okay, we say God can do everything, but how did this actually occur? Right? And especially with our understanding of modern science, how do we understand what actually occurred physically in the universe in terms of what this miracle is actually coming to say? Right? So the first thing that's worth reading is the Malbim. Okay? The Malbim in his commentary on Yoshua says as follows. ורוצה לומר שאף לעניין זמן הנקמה לא היה צריך זמן רב כל כך, בכל זאת לא אץ מעצמו לבוא. So he's commenting on the wording of the pasuk, right? Where he says that the sun stopped halfway through the sky and it didn't hasten to set. So what does that mean, it didn't hasten to set? So the Malbim says it means that even though Bnei Israel didn't need a full 24 hours or however long to finish defeating their enemies, even after they finished defeating their enemies, the sun did not hasten to set. Why not? Because only the sun and the moon stopped moving, but everything else continued to rotate according to its natural order. Right? All the stars in the constellations were in order to stop. The Malbim says, if the sun stops for less than 24 hours, less than a full day, everything is thrown out of whack, right? Because the full day is when there's 24 hours, and then everything, quote-unquote, resets in terms of the sun's position in relation to the rest of the stars and constellations. But if, let's say, the sun was paused for 15 hours, then the way everything would look before and after this miracle in terms of all of human history would be completely different. The Malbim says that that's not possible. If the sun had set after 12 hours, for example, if the sun set after pause for 12 hours and set, so it would be closest to the stars that it's normally farthest away from. The Malbim says, if this happened, this would be a change that would perpetuate forever after this miracle. And that would be a change in the entire fabric of reality of the universe. And he says, that's not possible. Right? So the Malbim says that's why it must be that the sun and the moon, whatever this miracle was, it was for an amount of time so that the alignment of everything else lined up exactly to the same place that it was when the sun stopped. That's when it started moving again. And that's what Kiyom Tamim is coming to teach me. It had to have been a full day, because if it had been less than a full day, it would have thrown the whole order of the cosmos completely out of whack, which is not feasible. ואז התחילה ללכת כפי הסדר קבוע במשמרותם. ולפי זה מוכרח גם כן כי השמש והירח לא דממו רק ממהלכם היומי. And so the Malbim goes even further. He says, and based on this, it's also clear that the sun and the moon only stopped in the sky in relation to their daily traverse of the heavens, of going, from east to west, and doing a daily rotation. Shemit no'aim mimizrach lema'arav, that they move from east to west. Aval mahalacham hashnati shemit no'aim mima'arav lemizrach lo nishbat az. But as we know, the sun and the moon, they don't just have a daily cycle where there's 24 hours, but there's also an annual cycle of 365 days. And if the sun and the moon stop for a full day, then that's going to throw the entire annual cycle off, because it's going to be a day postponed, right? Shima yaken הייתה מוכרחת לעמוד שנה תמימה עד שתשוב המערכת שהלך ביום ההוא ושינה סדרו מצבו נגד השמש והירח על מקומו הראשון. And so the Malbim says it can't be that that's what happened, because then, in order for things to align back to exactly the way they were from an annual perspective, the miracle would have had to have been that the sun and the moon were paused for an entire year. And that's not what happened, clearly. So, ואחר והשמש עמדה אז מתנועה מזרחית, בכל זה הלכה מהלך מעלה אחד למערב. הוכרחה לעמוד מעט יותר מכ"ד שעות, על באו כוכבים במקום שנטעה למערב, כנודע למעיין בתכונה, ועל כן אמר כיום תמים בכף הדמיון. And here the Malbim's Chiddush is, it wasn't exactly 24 hours that they paused. They paused for 24 hours and then a fraction of another hour, because it had to pause a little bit longer in order to correct for that 1 out of 365 day change in the entire cycle, that if they waited a little bit more than 24 hours, then the sun would align to where it would have been from an annual perspective. And the Malbim says this is what is known to those who are me'ayen b'tchuna, those who are, steeped in the knowledge of astronomy, right? And so his chiddush is, that's why it says kiyom tamim, right? That the lo atz lavo hashemesh kiyom tamim, like a full day. Not exactly a full day, but very close to a full day. It's kind of like with Makat Bechorot, right? When Moshe says, Kachatzi alayla, right? Because he says, the astrologers would say, oh, it's not exactly midnight. So he wrote Kachatzi alayla, even though God, of course, knows when midnight is exactly, but people might make a mistake. So Kachatzi alayla, so it's roughly midnight. It's basically approximately midnight. So here he says the same idea, Kiyom Tamim, because it wasn't exactly 24 hours, it was slightly above 24 hours to do both the daily and annual correction necessary to maintain the order of the cosmos before and after this miracle occurred. So that's the Malbim, right? It's pretty crazy.
Wow. Yeah.
Pretty wild, yeah. I heard this, I was pretty wild. And this is...
it's pretty like, it kind of fits with the modern understanding of astrology.
Yeah, Malbim is one of the eight...
The world, I guess it was spinning but not rotating. Stopped spinning but carried on rotating. Is kind of what he's saying.
Yeah. He's right. Malbim's pretty recent, I think, also historically. 1800s, right. Maybe. But you're right, yeah. He's looking at this like rationally, scientifically, trying to understand, like, how could this miracle have occurred, right? And he's almost boxed in based on this to disagree with Pirkei Eliezer that it was 36 hours. And basically to say, according to the opinion, that it was 24 hours of the sun pausing. I guess it could be the opinion of 36 hours, where it's 36 hours, 12 of movement, 24 pausing. But he has to agree with whatever opinion in the Gemara, which says that it was 24 hours that the sun was paused, not 36 hours was paused, because that would then throw off everything, and that doesn't work for him. So that's how the Malbim understands what this miracle.
Doesn't it throw off, like, because the time's still paused, like throw off when Shabbat would come in?
Say it again.
Like it's like, I guess Shabbat comes in, everything's done by the sun, but not by hours. Kind of that. So like, time obviously still passed while the sun was standing still. So like, in theory, Shabbat came in. Jump from like, time still passed even though there was no movement.
So that right.
So our whole calendar like a day skewed. Like
so that's right. That's the question, right? That's what's. You're raising a good point. If the sun stops in the sky, right? Does time still move on? Right. Does time pass?
Right.
Or is time basically frozen? Right? Meaning, and I think it's, of course, like, this isn't, if we view it through modern science's lens, like with relativity and all that, which I know is not what is going on here. But time is relative, right? Time only passes in so much as there's any sort of movement in space. So if everything is somehow miraculously frozen by God, so then in some real sense, time actually does not pass. All right? I don't really know what that means, but it's a good question, right? Like what you're saying is...
That's not what the Malbim says.
That's not...
says that other planets move, like everything else moves.
Right, of course, yeah. The Malbim is saying that everything else kept going the way it was. Right, what I'm saying now, because Malbim didn't know relativity, what I'm saying is, in theory, another way to understand this, according to, like a way to understand Pirkei Eliezer, is maybe to say, if not according to, not like the Malbim, but to say if everything stopped, like the whole universe somehow paused, right? Then that would mean, according to modern science's understanding, that time literally did not pass.
Yeah.
It's not as though everything froze and then there was like 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. When everything freezes from a movement perspective, right? Relativity says that time also stops, and then that's. But somehow Bnei Yisrael continued to fight their battle, like So
it's crazy.
It's pretty crazy, right? Once you stop to actually think about this miracle, it becomes pretty challenging. And so I'll actually skip the Abarbanel and go to the Ralbag, because he's the real kind of clincher here. The Ralbag he's the most I would say rationalist of the Rishonim, right? He's very Aristotelian. He's very into. I think he's the one who says he tries to limit. He doesn't try to limit, but basically the question of free will versus determinism in terms of how can we have free will if God knows what we're going to do. The Ralbag, basically in his works on philosophy, almost says that in certain respects God does not know what we're going to do. That free will requires God to have a limit on his knowledge of the future events that we choose. That he was very rational in his approach to things, right? So the Ralbag really struggles with this particular miracle, and see how he reinterprets it. This blew my mind. So he says, Bezot parasha yesh sfekot rabot. So there's a lot of difficulties with this story. Ra'ui le'ayen bahen. And they're worth pondering. Ha'echad, who, and what is the first one? And this is actually funny, because I didn't think about it in these terms till he said it, but once he says it, you're like, hey, wait a minute, right? He says, She'im haya she'ashemesh amad ubitam ha'tznua ha'nir'et lo. If it's true that the sun actually stood and stopped moving in his normal path, that miracle is infinitely more incredible than any of the miracles that were done by Moshe. Right? Because he says, everything that Moshe did with the makot and the miracles in the midbar, those were all supernatural in the sense that it was a change in nature, but on earth, right? You change something about the way the world works. But v'hu yoter nifla l'shiur ma shishtamesh bo elu hanimtzaot hanichbadot לשנות את תפקידם משלוט על הנמצאות השפלות אלו לשנות עניין סידורם. כי בהם בעצמן מחיסרון הסדר והיושר מה שלא ייעלם. But here you're saying that the miracle wasn't just that God changed the nature of on earth, the order of, or even the sky, right? Or things that happened in the sky or on earth. Here you're saying God changed something about the entire universe, the entire reality. Like, that's infinitely crazier of a miracle than anything that Moshe did. And the Ralbag says, like, what? I mean, he doesn't say it explicitly, but it's almost like, if that's the case, why is this like two psukim nestled in Yeshua somewhere, right? Like, this should be kind of like the craziest thing that, like this is the greatest testament to God's power of anything. Yeah, so the way he says it is kind of like, whoa, yeah, you're right. Right? And he says this is obvious to anybody who thinks about this a little bit. You don't even have to explain it. It's very clear why this miracle is so much greater than any of the miracles that Moshe did. Okay, and then he talks for a very, very, very long time and says a lot of things, which I didn't actually read to the fullest. But if we skip to the end, his conclusion is the following. Hine nashuv levaer divrei zot parasha, veomer shemamar Yoshua haya, sheterem shiasur hashemesh miyot al givon, ve'ayrech miyot al emek ayalon, teshalem nikmat goy oivav. So, to understand this, we have to actually look at the psukim and read them carefully. Because the Ralbag looks at the psukim very carefully. He says, it says in Yoshua Perek Yud, right? Az yadber Yoshua la Hashem, we saw this in the Midrash. Yoshua spoke to Hashem, B'yom tet Hashem et emori lifnei b'nei Yisrael, on the day that God gave the Jews victory. V'yomer le'nei Yisrael, shemesh b'giv'on dom, v'reach be'emek ayalon. Right? He said, sun stand still and moon stand still. Okay? And then it says, Vaydom hashemesh ve'ereach hamad, the sun stood still and the moon stood still, ad yikom goy oivav, until Bnei Israel had avenged themselves of the enemies. So the Ralbag says, if you read it carefully, what Yoshua was saying was that before the sun would move from Giv'on, and before the moon would move from Emek Ayalon, the nation would finish avenging themselves upon their enemy. Aval kitzer katuv bezeh, but he shortened it for poetic purposes. Ve'orel zeh ma she'amar charav, vayidom hashemesh ve'ereach hamad ad yikom goy oivav. Because the next pasuk says that the sun stood still and the moon stood still until Bnei Israel defeated the Amorites. But the Ralbag says we've been reading it all wrong this whole time. That doesn't mean, there's two ways to understand that. There's the way that we've understood it until now, which is that Bnei Israel fought this long battle, and the sun stood in the sky and the moon stood in the sky until they finished the battle. But what's another way that we can interpret this? Or what's the Ralbag hinting at? Right? He says, "V'haratzon bezeh shekvar damam hashemesh begivon v'rech be'emek ha'elon ad shenishlama zot ha'melacha me'an nekama." That the whole point is that the sun, it's all talui on the finishing of the vengeance. The Bnei Israel, that what Yoshua was saying and what the Psukim are telling us, is that the sun and the moon stood still until Bnei Israel finished defeating their enemies. So what he says, what it's really saying, is not that the sun and the moon miraculously stood still. It's that Bnei Israel miraculously defeated their enemies in such a short amount of time that the sun and the moon, which didn't change their natural order, hadn't moved in the sky.
Right.
Yeah? So it's as though they stood still miraculously, but in a poetic sense, because it's a testament to how quickly Bnei Israel were able to defeat their enemies. So you have in Sefer Yashar this book of poems about like battles. So you say the sun stood still, the moon stood still, which is really just a beautiful way of praising God's helping Bnei Israel defeat their enemy in this miraculously short amount of time. So it's still a miracle, but now the miracle is like a Moshe level miracle. All right, like Bnei Israel defeating their enemy really quickly. That's very different from stopping the entire universe from its normal cycle and order of the cosmos. So that's the Ralbag's way of dealing with this, is he like completely reinterprets the miracle. And so he says, right, v'zeh inyan nifla, ki lo dai she'ad shenakmu Yisrael me'akamim alehem, aval yad im zeh shezot hanekama teshalem b'zman katzar, kazeh. Right, the miracle was that the Bnei Israel were able to defeat the Amorites so quickly. That was the miracle. Ulezeh amar. And then the Ralbag says, and this is what the last pasuk means. Right, the last pasuk says, there had never been a day like this before in history, and there was never a day like this after in history, where God listened to the voice of a man. Ki Hashem nilcham Yisrael. Right. That God fought for Israel. So the Ralbag says that was why it was so unique. God had never fought for Israel, right? Lishma b'kol ki Hashem nilcham Yisrael. ולזה היו יכולים להשלים הנקמה בזה הזמן הקצר, כי יד השם יתברך לא תקצר. Because God can do anything in the sense that there had never been a battle that had been finished so quickly where God had fought on Bnei Israel's behalf and finished it like instantaneously for them, the victory. Right? לפי שלא ידעו השם יתברך שתשלם זו הנקמה הזה בזמן קצר. אבל השם יתברך שמע לקולו that basically that is what the miracle was, that God listened to Yoshua in the sense that he intervened in the battle and had Bnei Israel actually win very, very quickly. And this is actually even supported by a pasuk which we didn't even talk about, but even before the miracle is mentioned, it says as the Amorites were fleeing, it says V'Hashem hishlich alehem avanim gdolot min hashamayim, that these huge boulders fell from the sky and crushed the Amorites. Right? Rabim asher metu be'avnei barad me'asher hargu b'nei Yisrael b'charev. And more of the enemy died from these boulders that were falling from the sky that God threw than from the sword that Bnei Yisrael vanquished them. So this was this miraculous intervention on God's behalf in the battle, and that's what's being commemorated and poetically being stated as the sun and the moon pausing, but that's very, very, very different from how everybody else in the Midrashim interpret the miracle that occurred. But the Ralbag was so bothered by the implications of this miracle, even when talking about Hakadosh Baruch Hu, that he had to reinterpret the miracle into something that was feasible within the kind of the world that we live in. What do you think about that?
I mean, that makes a lot more sense. It goes against everything else.
Yeah. But I think it makes...
when you read the Psukim, that still could be, that fits within the actual Psukim nicely.
Right.
Like, there's no problem, makes you think, why is everyone else saying differently? That seems to make so much more sense.
Yeah. I think it can get... I don't think it's a stretch to read it in. I'm with you.
No, not at all.
Just because the simple, straightforward reading of the psukim is that the sun stood still. It's like you kind of have to interpret that main thing as being either poetic or implying something else, right? It doesn't. In other words, I guess the argument would be, if that's what the miracle was, why don't you say that the miracle was that the battle finished very, very quickly? But that's not said. It's only said poetically through this idea that the sun stood still. So that makes sense, but then it's kind of... But yeah, I mean, I think the Rambam makes a lot of sense here, honestly. It's an ingenious reading, and but then he doesn't have any of the problems, that anyone else had,
right?
Because the sun and the moon didn't actually.
You just got the problem of why didn't it just say that the battle was very quick?
Right, but then you don't have any problems of like the Malbim or the Gemara of like how much time. He's like nothing. He's saying, nothing changed. What changed was on Earth that the battle went very quickly. Zakol.
Right.
So yeah.
Crazy stuff.
Cool. Thanks. Shkoyach. All right. With that, Hadron Alach Ein Yaakov. Shkoyach. Very, very, very good. So for the Chagim, I'll because now it's gonna be Rosh Hashanah next week, and then Kippur Sukkot, whatever. So we'll take a break for the Chagim, and then I'll talk to the guys about. I have an idea about what to do like next year if people are interested, but take it in the WhatsApp.
Good.
All right, Michael. Thank you.
And also, are you going to be in Sion? Or are you davening like